The stable boy had barely finished buckling the saddle when Genevieve heard her husband's boots on the gravel behind her, sharp and deliberate, the sound of a man who expected to be obeyed before he even opened his mouth. "You are not riding to Oakenford in that," Duke Alastair said. Genevieve did not turn around. She tightened the girth strap on her stallion, Ferris, and checked the buckle twice before she answered him. "I am riding to Oakenford in exactly this." She wore fitted leather riding breeches beneath a long wool coat cut close to her figure, tall boots polished to a dull shine, and gloves stained faintly with oil from the foundry workshop she had spent half the night in. It was not the attire of a duchess, it was the attire of a woman who intended to be useful. Alastair stepped closer, and even in the grey half-light of dawn, she could see the muscle working in his jaw. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the sort of composed authority that made boardrooms fall silent when he entered them. That authority did nothing to move her. "Lord Vance arrives at 9, he said. "He is the single largest foreign investor this county has ever courted, and he will be greeted by the Duchess of Ironridge, not by a woman dressed for mucking out a stable." "Lord Vance is coming to see whether our foundry can deliver what we promise," Genevieve said, finally facing him. Her eyes, pale grey and steady, held his without flinching. "He is not coming to admire my sleeves. He is coming to see civility, order, the dignity of this house." Alastair's voice dropped lower, the way it did when he was trying to sound reasonable instead of furious. "Go inside, Genevieve. Put on the blue silk. We have perhaps 20 minutes before the carriage must leave." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The morning mist still clung low over the courtyard, curling around the wheels of the waiting carriage, and somewhere beyond the stable wall a rooster called out, indifferent to the quiet battle being fought in the yard. Genevieve had married Alastair 18 months ago, a match arranged to merge two struggling estates into one solvent enterprise. She had not expected love. She had not particularly wanted it. What she had wanted, and what she had been quietly building in secret since the wedding, was purpose. A place inside the ironworks that was hers by right of knowledge, not by right of marriage. She was, after all, the daughter of an engineer. Her father had spent 30 years designing pressure valves and forge mechanisms before his death left her with nothing but his notebooks and a mind that understood machinery the way other women understood embroidery. She had spent the last year teaching herself everything Ironridge's foundry masters knew, and a great deal they did not. "Dress like a duchess, Genevieve, or stay home," Alastair said finally, folding his arms. "I will not have you humiliate this house in front of Vance." The words landed harder than he perhaps intended. She felt the sting of them settle somewhere beneath her ribs, but she did not let it show on her face. Instead, she reached up and adjusted the collar of her coat, buttoning the top clasp with slow, deliberate fingers. "Then, I suppose," she said quietly, "I shall have to humiliate you instead." She swung up onto Ferris before Alastair could answer, settling into the saddle with the ease of a woman who had ridden in the past, who had never once been taught that a lady ought to sit side saddle and smile prettily while the men discussed business beyond her hearing. She gathered the reins, looked down at her husband one final time, and saw something flicker across his face. Not quite anger, not quite alarm, but something caught between the two. "Genevieve, the carriage will be slow on the coal road," she said. "I will see you at the exhibition grounds, Your Grace." She did not wait for his reply. She dug her heel gently into Ferris's flank, and the stallion surged forward through the courtyard gate, hooves striking sparks against the cobblestones, mane whipping in the cold morning air. Behind her, she heard Alastair call her name once more, sharper this time, but the wind and the distance swallowed whatever else he meant to say. The ride to Oakenford took the better part of an hour, out past the hedgerows and the low stone walls that marked the boundary of Ironridge land, down through the valley where the smoke of a dozen smaller forges already rose thin and grey against the sky. Genevieve did not slow. She had spent months preparing for this exhibition, the miniature steam-driven forge model tucked carefully in a leather satchel strapped across her back, its brass fittings polished until they gleamed, its pressure gauge calibrated to a precision she had checked and rechecked a dozen times. If Alistair wanted a duchess who curtsied and made pleasant conversation while men decided the fate of the estate, he had married the wrong woman. She would not curtsy today. She would not smile prettily and defer to her husband's judgment on matters she understood better than he did. By the time the grand stone gates of the Oakenford exhibition grounds rose into view, banners snapping in the wind and carriages already lining the drive, Genevieve had made her decision. She would not wait in the grand hall for Alistair to arrive and present her properly. She would go straight to the display floor, straight to the machinery, and let her work speak in a language far older and far more honest than silk and etiquette. She urged Ferris forward, past the gathering crowd of finely dressed spectators, straight toward the Foundry Pavilion, and toward whatever consequences waited for her on the other side of her defiance. Alistair arrived at the exhibition grounds 15 minutes behind schedule, his carriage having been forced to a crawl along the coal road exactly as Genevieve predicted, and the first thing he saw upon stepping down was Lord Vance standing beneath the striped awning of the grand hall, watch in hand, his expression the particular blend of patience and disappointment that wealthy men reserved for those who kept them waiting. "Your Grace." Vance was a lean, silver-haired man with sharp eyes that missed very little, dressed in a charcoal frock coat that had clearly never seen the inside of a workshop. "I had hoped to meet the Duchess as well." "She was delayed," Alistair said, the lie sitting uneasily on his tongue. "Matters at the estate." It was not entirely false. He simply left out that the matter delaying her was her own stubbornness, and that she had likely already reached the grounds well ahead of him on a horse that could outrun his carriage twice over. He led Vance through the grand hall, past rows of polished display cases showing off the county's finest ironwork, ornamental gates, decorative railings, the sort of ceremonial pieces meant to impress rather than function. Vance nodded politely at each one, but Alistair could see the boredom creeping into his eyes. This was not what the man had travelled 300 miles to see. He wanted proof of production capacity, not decoration. They were halfway through the hall when a murmur rippled through the crowd near the far doors, the kind of low, curious sound a gathering makes when something unexpected has caught its attention. Alistair felt his stomach tighten before he even turned his head. Genevieve stood at the edge of the display floor, still in her riding coat and boots, the leather satchel now open on a workbench before her, its brass and copper contents laid out with the precise care of a surgeon preparing instruments. A small crowd of foundry masters and engineers had already gathered around her, drawn less by curiosity about a duchess in unusual dress, and more by the object taking shape beneath her hands. "That is my wife," Alistair said, more to himself than to Vance. Vance's eyebrows lifted. "The Duchess builds machinery." "She has an interest in it," Alistair said carefully, though the word interest felt woefully inadequate as he watched Genevieve fit a small brass cylinder into place with the ease of a woman who had done it 100 times before. They crossed the floor together, and as they drew closer, Alistair could hear her voice, clear and unhurried, explaining the mechanism to the men around her. "The trouble with most forge models is that they demonstrate heat without demonstrating control," she was saying, adjusting a small valve at the base of the device. "Any furnace can grow hot. The question that matters to a buyer is whether that heat can be regulated without wasting coal or risking the boiler. This model does both." She struck a small flint mechanism at the base, and within moments a thin column of steam began to rise from the miniature forge, the tiny bellows working in a slow, steady rhythm entirely of their own accord, requiring no hand to pump them. The crowd made a sound of genuine surprise. Vance stepped forward before Alistair could stop him. His boredom vanished entirely, replaced by the sharp attention of a man who had just recognized something valuable. "You built this yourself, Duchess?" Genevieve looked up, and for the briefest moment her eyes flicked to Alistair, some silent question passing between them, an offer, perhaps, to let him answer first, to let him claim the credit a husband was expected to claim. He said nothing. He could not think of a single word to say. "I designed the pressure regulation, my lord," she said, turning back to Vance. "The rest is drawn from my father's original notebooks. He spent 30 years perfecting forge efficiency before his death. I have simply continued his work." "Continued it remarkably well." Vance crouched beside the model, studying the valve mechanism with the intensity of a man doing arithmetic in his head. Tell me, does this scale? Could a furnace the size of my Bristol works be regulated on this same principle? It could, Genevieve said, though the ratios would need adjusting for volume, and the coal feed would require a secondary valve I have not yet built into this model. Could you build it? Given 3 weeks and access to a proper foundry, yes. Vance straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the particular weight of a man making a decision he did not intend to reconsider. I came to Oakenford expecting to discuss a manufacturing contract with the Duke. I find myself far more interested in discussing it with you, Duchess. The words landed in the space between Alistair and Genevieve like a stone dropped into still water, and Alistair felt the ripples of it spread through every man watching. Foundry masters exchanged glances. A journalist near the back of the crowd was already scribbling notes. This was not how the exhibition was meant to unfold. He had spent months courting Vance's investment, months building the careful reputation of Ironridge as a house of order and tradition, and in the span of 10 minutes, his wife had unraveled every careful thread of it, not through scandal, but through sheer, undeniable competence. "My lord," Alistair said, forcing calm into his voice, "any contract would naturally be arranged through the estate, through myself, as the Duke, yes, I understand the formality of it." Vance waved a hand, already turning back toward Genevieve. "But I have built my fortune on recognizing talent where it stands, not where etiquette insists it ought to be. Duchess, might we speak further this afternoon? Privately?" Genevieve glanced once more at Alistair. Whatever she saw in his face, she did not let it stop her. "Of course, my lord," she said. "I would be glad to." Alistair stood very still amid the murmuring crowd, watching his wife shake hands with the most powerful investor in the county, and understood, with a cold, sinking certainty, that whatever careful order he had built his marriage upon had just cracked wide open in front of every important man in the district. The private pavilion had been set aside for exactly this purpose: quiet conversations away from the noise of the exhibition floor, where serious men could discuss serious money without an audience. Genevieve had changed nothing about her appearance before walking in. She still wore the riding coat, the boots, the faint smell of coal smoke clinging to her sleeves, and if Lord Vance found any of it improper, he gave no sign of it. "Sit, Duchess, please." He gestured to a chair near a small writing table already scattered with papers, shipping manifests, cost projections, figures that told her he had come prepared to make an offer to somebody long before he ever arrived at Oakenford. "I will be direct with you, as I find directness saves us both a great deal of time." "I would prefer that, my lord." "I need a manufacturing partner capable of producing regulated forge equipment at scale and capable of doing it within the year. I have looked at 3 other estates before yours. None of them showed me anything beyond ornamental ironwork and empty promises." He tapped the edge of the desk. "You showed me a working model with a solved engineering problem I have been trying to solve for 2 years. Genevieve kept her hands folded in her lap, though her pulse had quickened considerably. "You wish to offer the contract to Ironridge?" "I wish to offer the contract to you." Vance's eyes held hers without apology. "I understand the estate bears your husband's name and his title, but I did not come here to invest in a title. I came to invest in a mind that can build what I need. If that mind belongs to the Duchess rather than the Duke, then it is the Duchess I intend to do business with." It was, Genevieve knew, exactly the sort of offer she had spent a year quietly hoping for and never quite believing would arrive. She thought of her father's notebooks, worn soft at the corners from years of handling, of the nights she had spent teaching herself calculations no governess had ever thought to include in her education. She thought, too, of Alistair's face on the exhibition floor, pale and rigid, watching everything he had built slip sideways in front of him. "I accept the terms of discussion, my lord," she said carefully, "though any formal contract will require the Duke's signature alongside my own. Ironridge is his estate as much as mine." "Naturally." Vance smiled, satisfied. "I only wished to know whose judgment I was truly investing in." Now I know. They spoke for the better part of an hour, working through figures and delivery schedules, and by the time Genevieve finally rose to leave the pavilion, a rough agreement had already taken shape between them, one that would see Ironridge's foundry transformed from a modest county operation into the primary supplier for Vance's expanding works in Bristol. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, stepping out into the corridor, she found Alistair waiting for her, and the look on his face told her the triumph would have to wait. "A word," he said, and it was not a request. He led her into an empty antechamber off the main hall and shut the door behind them with more force than was strictly necessary. For a long moment he said nothing, simply standing with his back to her, one hand braced against the mantel. "Do you have any understanding," he said finally, "of what you have done today? I have secured the largest contract this estate has ever been offered. You have made me look a fool in front of every man of consequence in this county." He turned to face her, and the fury in his eyes was tempered by something rawer underneath it, something closer to humiliation. "Lord Vance did not simply express interest in your work, Genevieve. He dismissed me, publicly, as though I were a decorative fixture standing beside the woman who actually matters. That is not what happened. That is precisely what happened, and you know it." He raked a hand through his hair, pacing the narrow room. "I am the Duke of Ironridge. Every contract, every negotiation, every decision touching this estate is meant to pass through me. That is not vanity, Genevieve. That is how this world functions. And you walked onto that floor in riding clothes and dismantled it in 10 minutes. "I dismantled nothing that was working, Alistair." Her voice stayed level, though heat had crept into it now. "I built something that solved a problem you did not know we had. I have spent a year studying my father's designs, while you spent your days managing accounts and shaking hands. You call it humiliation. I call it the first time in 18 months that anyone in this county has looked at me and seen something other than your wife." The words hit harder than she intended, and she watched something shift in his expression, not softened exactly, but startled, as though the thought had never once occurred to him. "I did not marry you to erase you," he said quietly. "You did not marry me to see me either." She held his gaze, refusing to look away first. "You married me because our fathers needed our estates joined. That was the whole of it. I have spent this last year trying to make something useful of that arrangement, and today, for the first time, someone outside this house recognized it." Alistair said nothing for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, heavier than the argument itself, until finally he exhaled and looked away toward the window, toward the exhibition grounds still bustling beyond the glass. "The contract will require my signature," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier fury. "Vance made that clear to me as well." "I told him as much myself." "Then, I suppose," Alistair said, "we shall have to learn to work as partners, whether either of us intended it or not." It was not an apology. But it was, Genevieve realized, as she watched him finally meet her eyes again, the first honest thing he had said to her all day. 2 days after the exhibition, the contract papers sat signed and sealed in Alistair's study, but the agreement between husband and wife remained far less settled than the one between Ironridge and Lord Vance. They had spoken little since the antechamber, exchanging only the necessary courtesies of a household running its daily business, and Genevieve had grown tired of waiting for the silence to soften on its own. So she rode out to the Coal Valley depot instead, telling no one but the stable boy where she meant to go. The depot lay 4 miles east of Ironridge, tucked into a shallow gorge where the coal wagons came down from the northern pits before being loaded onto barges bound for the foundry. It was not a place Duchesses were expected to visit, which was precisely why Genevieve wanted to see it with her own eyes. If Ironridge intended to fulfill Vance's contract within the year, every link in the chain, from raw coal to finished iron, needed to hold firm. And she had learned long ago that a chain only revealed its weak point when someone bothered to examine it closely. The depot manager, a stout man named Mr. Higgins with soot permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles, seemed startled to find the Duchess dismounting at his gate unannounced. Your Grace. He wiped his hands hastily on his apron, as though that might somehow make him presentable. We weren't expecting. I know you weren't, Mr. Higgins. That is rather the point of an inspection. She kept her tone light, though her eyes were already moving past him toward the storage yard, where the coal stocks were meant to be piled high in preparation for the foundry's increased output. Instead, she found the yard nearly bare, only a scattering of low, uneven heaps where mountains ought to have been. Where is the rest of it? She asked. Higgins hesitated, and that hesitation told her more than his answer would. Delayed, Your Grace. The northern pits have been slow sending their wagons down. For how long? A fortnight, near enough. Genevieve walked further into the yard, running a gloved hand along the edge of one meager coal pile, doing the arithmetic in her head without needing to write it down. At this rate of delivery, the foundry would run short of fuel within 3 weeks, long before the first shipment for Vance's Bristol works was due to leave port. It was not a minor inconvenience. It was the sort of failure that could unravel the entire contract before it had properly begun. Show me the delivery ledger, she said. Higgins led her into the small wooden office at the edge of the yard and produced a battered logbook, its pages filled with dates and tonnage figures in cramped handwriting. Genevieve studied it carefully, and the longer she looked, the more the pattern troubled her. The delays were not scattered or random, the sort of thing weather or broken wagon wheels might explain. They were regular, precise. Every shipment from the northern pits arriving exactly 3 to 4 days later than scheduled, week after week, as though someone were deliberately holding the coal back just long enough to strain the foundry without stopping production entirely. Who manages the contracts with the northern pits? She asked. A broker out of Stonehaven, Your Grace, name of Pargeter. Been handling it for years, long before your marriage. Has anything changed recently? New buyers competing for the same coal, perhaps? Higgins scratched at his jaw, thinking. There's been talk, now you mention it. Another foundry putting in higher offers for the same pits. Old Lord Marchmont's works, out past Thistledown. Traditional forge, not much call for it these days, but he's been throwing money about trying to keep his furnaces lit. Genevieve went very still. Lord Marchmont. She knew the name only in passing, a minor nobleman with an aging estate and a forge that had once supplied half the county before Ironridge's newer methods began drawing business away. A man with every reason to resent a contract as large as Vance's landing in a rival's hands, and precisely the sort of quiet, respectable motive that would never appear in a ledger as anything so obvious as sabotage. Mr. Higgins, she said slowly, I want you to write to Pargeter and request the original delivery contracts, the ones signed before this delay began. Every date, every signature. You think something's amiss, Your Grace? I think, Genevieve said, closing the ledger with a soft, deliberate click, that someone is starving our foundry of coal just slowly enough that no one would think to question it until it was too late to matter. She rode back to Ironridge as the afternoon light began to fade gold over the hills, the weight of what she had found settling heavier with every mile. This was not simply a matter of proving herself capable at an exhibition, nor of winning an argument with her husband over the propriety of her dress. If the coal shortage was deliberate, and if it traced back to Marchmont's jealousy over a lost contract, then Ironridge stood to lose far more than pride. They stood to lose Vance entirely, and with him, the single greatest opportunity the estate had ever been offered. By the time she reached the courtyard, dusk had settled fully, and she found Alistair waiting near the stable, arms folded, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. For once, she did not wait for him to speak first. We have a problem, she said, dismounting quickly, and it is considerably larger than the argument we have been having. By the following evening, word of the coal shortage had reached further than Genevieve intended, and not through any doing of her own. Higgins, it seemed, had grown nervous enough about the missing shipments to send a warning letter directly to the Board of Trustees, the small council of landowners and investors who had overseen Ironridge's finances since long before Alistair's father had died. By the time Genevieve learned of the letter, the board had already convened in the drawing room, and the tone of the conversation drifting through the closed door was not one of concern for the estate's supply chain. It was concern for her. "She has no business wandering about coal depots unescorted," came the reedy voice of old Mr. Ashworth, the eldest trustee, a man who had never once in Genevieve's presence addressed her directly if he could help it. "First the exhibition, now this. The Duchess oversteps her position at every turn, and I fear the consequences will land squarely upon this estate's reputation." "The consequences of a coal shortage will land upon this estate's finances," Alistair's voice cut in, tight and clipped. "Whatever you think of her methods are precisely the trouble, Your Grace." This from a second trustee, a heavy-set man named Chalmers, who managed the estate's banking arrangements. A duchess inspecting depots, negotiating contracts, poring over ledgers meant for men trained in trade. It is not merely unconventional, it invites ridicule, and ridicule invites doubt, and doubt is the one thing an estate cannot afford when courting investors as significant as Lord Vance. Genevieve stood outside the door for only a moment longer, still in the same riding coat and boots she had worn to the depot the day before, dust from the coal yard not yet brushed from her hem. She had meant to change before facing the board. She decided, quite suddenly, that she would not. She pushed the door open without knocking. 6 trustees turned toward her in varying degrees of surprise, seated around the long mahogany table that dominated the drawing room, and for a moment the only sound was the soft crackle of the fire in the grate. Alistair stood near the window, and something in his expression shifted at the sight of her. Not quite relief, but close to it. "Gentlemen," Genevieve said, stepping fully into the room. "I understand you have been discussing my conduct rather than the matter that actually threatens this estate." Ashworth's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Your Grace, this is a meeting of the board." "Which concerns my husband's estate, my contract with Lord Vance, and the coal shortage I discovered myself, 4 miles from this house, while apparently no one else thought it worth investigating." She crossed to the table, reached into the satchel still slung across her shoulder, and laid out the ledger pages she had copied by hand the previous night, along with the delivery dates she had cross-referenced against Marchmont's known dealings with the northern pits. "Perhaps you would prefer to discuss that instead?" Chalmers glanced at the papers with visible reluctance, as though acknowledging them might somehow validate the manner of their delivery. "Duchess, whatever irregularities you believe you have found, this is not the proper venue." "There is no proper venue for a fortnight's worth of missing coal shipments, sir, save the one where the men responsible for this estate's finances are gathered in a single room." Her voice did not rise, but it did not soften either. "Every delay traces back to the same pattern. Every pattern points toward Lord Marchmont bidding against us for the same pits, quietly, consistently, since roughly the time our contract with Lord Vance became public knowledge." "You suspect Lord Marchmont of deliberate sabotage?" Ashworth's tone carried open skepticism, though Genevieve noted he had not yet dismissed the papers outright. A serious accusation to level at a man of his standing. "I suspect nothing I cannot support with dates and signatures, which is more than I can say for the accusations leveled against me in this room before I arrived." She let that land, watching Ashworth's jaw tighten. "If the board wishes to spend its energy debating my dress and my deportment while our fuel supply quietly dries up beneath us, that is the board's prerogative. But I would remind you that the contract you are so anxious to protect the estate's reputation for will collapse entirely if the foundry cannot meet its first delivery to Bristol." Silence settled over the table. Alistair had not moved from the window, but Genevieve could feel his attention fixed on her now, weighing something behind his composed expression. "I move," Chalmers said finally, though clearly with some reluctance, "that the board authorize a formal inquiry into the Coal Valley delays before any decision is made regarding the Duchess's conduct." "Seconded," said a third trustee, a younger man who had said nothing until now. Ashworth's eyes flicked toward Alistair, plainly hoping the Duke might overrule his own wife and settle the matter more comfortably. Alistair straightened instead, stepping away from the window. "The inquiry will proceed," he said, "and until it concludes, no decision will be made regarding my wife's involvement in this estate's affairs." He met Genevieve's eyes across the table, something unreadable passing between them. She found what none of us did. I see no reason to silence the one voice that has actually been useful. The trustees exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued further. Genevieve gathered her papers slowly, aware of the small, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. Not triumph exactly, but something closer to being seen, finally, by the one person in the room whose opinion she had least expected to shift. 2 nights later, Genevieve told no one where she was going, though she suspected Alistair would guess soon enough. The inquiry Chalmers had proposed would take weeks to move through proper channels, weeks Ironridge did not have if the coal delays continued unchecked. She had no patience for waiting on paperwork while the foundry's fuel stores dwindled by the day, so she had spent the previous evening studying the delivery routes herself, tracing the wagon paths from the northern pits down through the valley, until she found the one place where a shipment could be quietly diverted without ever appearing in Pargeter's official ledgers. The Blackwood River Canal lock, half a mile past the depot, where barges loaded with coal passed through on their way to the foundry docks. She reached the canal a little after 10, Ferris tethered in a stand of trees well back from the towpath, and settled herself in the shadow of the lock-keeper's empty hut to wait. The night was cold and clear, the moon bright enough to silver the water, and she had waited perhaps 40 minutes, growing steadily more certain she had guessed wrong, when she heard the soft crunch of boots on gravel behind her. She turned sharply, one hand already reaching for the small lantern at her belt, and found Alistair standing a few feet away, wrapped in a dark greatcoat, looking entirely unrepentant about having followed her. "You might have told me," he said quietly, crouching beside her in the shadows. "You might have stayed home." "And let you confront coal thieves alone in the dark?" "No." He glanced toward the canal, toward the dark shape of a barge already moored at the far bank, its cargo hold covered but unmistakably full. "How long have you suspected this particular crossing?" "Since this morning. It is the only point along the route where a barge could be quietly unloaded and reloaded without the depot ever noticing the discrepancy in weight." They did not have long to wait. Within the hour, lantern light appeared at the far end of the towpath, and 3 men emerged from the darkness, moving toward the moored barge with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. Genevieve recognized none of them, though the crest stitched into the collar of the foreman's coat was unmistakable even in poor light, the crossed hammers of Marchmont's traditional forge. "There," she breathed. "That is our proof." They watched in silence as the men began transferring sacks of coal from the barge onto a smaller cart, clearly bound elsewhere, clearly never meant to reach Ironridge's foundry at all. Alistair's jaw tightened beside her, fury replacing whatever doubt had lingered in him until now. They might have simply watched, gathered what evidence they could, and returned quietly to the estate to bring the matter before the board with irrefutable proof. That had been Genevieve's plan from the start. But fate, as it so often did, had other intentions. A groan of straining metal cut through the night, followed by a sharp crack, and one of the men shouted in alarm as the barge lurched hard against its mooring. The old winch controlling the lock gate had given way under the uneven weight shift, and without it, the gate itself had begun swinging loose, the full pressure of the canal's upper water level pressing against it, threatening to burst it open entirely and send the heavy gate crashing down onto the men below. Genevieve was moving before she had fully decided to move. "The gate," she said, already scrambling down the bank. "If that mechanism fails completely, it will crush anyone standing near it." Alistair caught her arm. "Genevieve, there is a manual release lever, there, beside the winch housing. If we can secure it by hand before the pressure builds further, we can hold the gate steady until the men clear the towpath." She did not wait for his agreement. She was already running toward the lock, and after only a heartbeat's hesitation, Alistair followed. The men from Marchmont's forge scattered at the sight of them, abandoning their cart and vanishing into the dark rather than be caught. But Genevieve barely registered their retreat. Her attention was fixed entirely on the groaning gate mechanism, on the heavy iron lever, slick with damp and threatening to slip from her grip the moment she seized it. "Here," she gasped. "Hold it steady while I reset the tension pin." Alistair did not question her. He threw his weight against the lever exactly where she directed, his greatcoat forgotten, his hands raw against the cold iron, while Genevieve worked quickly at the winch housing, fingers moving with a precision born of a year spent studying exactly this sort of mechanism in her father's notebooks. It took the better part of 10 agonizing minutes, both of them soaked through with canal spray and effort, before the gate finally groaned back into its proper alignment and held. They stood afterward in the sudden quiet, breathing hard. The danger passed as swiftly as it had arrived. Alistair looked at her then in a way he never quite had before. Something in his expression softened past recognition, stripped of the composure he wore like armor in every drawing room and board meeting. "You knew exactly what to do," he said, still catching his breath. "Without hesitation. I have spent a year learning things you never thought to ask me about." "I am beginning to understand that." He studied her a moment longer. Coal dust and canal water streaked across her face, and something in his voice when he spoke again had lost its familiar edge entirely. "I do not think I have ever truly seen you until tonight, Genevieve." She said nothing, but she did not look away from him either, and for the first time since their wedding day, the silence between them felt less like distance and more like the quiet beginning of something neither of them had expected to find. 2 days after the incident at the canal lock, the foundry office had become an unlikely shared territory. Genevieve had claimed the long work table beneath the window years ago in all but name, though she had never before had reason to share it with her husband. Now, Alistair sat across from her most mornings, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a stack of blueprints and shipping records spread between them, the two of them working through the evidence with the same quiet focus they had once reserved for arguing. "The damaged winch mechanism," Genevieve said, tapping the schematic she had sketched from memory the night after the canal. "It was not simply old age that caused it to fail. Look here, at the housing bolts. Someone loosened them deliberately, weeks before we ever caught Marchmont's men at the barge." Alistair leaned over the drawing, studying the marks she had circled. "You are certain?" "I'm certain enough to have Higgins inspect the original installation records. If the bolts were tampered with before the coal delays even began, then the delays were never meant to be the whole of the plan. They were meant to weaken the mechanism slowly, so that when the barge traffic increased under the new contract, the gate would fail under pressure exactly as it nearly did. To sabotage the entire delivery route, not merely delay it." Alistair sat back, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "That is not the work of a man simply hoping to outbid us for coal, Genevieve. That is deliberate ruin." It had taken them the better part of a week to piece together the full shape of it, working through Higgins's ledgers alongside the delivery contracts Pargeter had finally, reluctantly, produced. What emerged was a pattern far more calculated than either of them had first suspected. The coal delays had begun the very week Vance's contract became public knowledge in Stonehaven's trading circles. The winch tampering had followed within a fortnight, and running beneath both, quiet as a current under still water, was a trail of payments made from an account registered under a false name, funneling money toward two of the very men Genevieve and Alistair had watched flee the canal that night. "The account traces to a solicitor's office in Thistledown," Alistair said, sliding the relevant papers across the table. "Marchmont's own man of business handles it." Genevieve studied the signature at the bottom of the transfer document, her stomach tightening with the particular satisfaction of watching a suspicion finally harden into fact. "He did not even trouble himself to hide it well. I suspect he never imagined anyone would look closely enough to find it." "He did not imagine my wife would ride out to a coal depot and start reading ledgers," Alistair said, and there was something almost wry in his voice now, an edge of admiration where fury had once lived. They worked in silence for a while after that, sorting the remaining documents into some order that might be presented before the board, and Genevieve found herself unexpectedly comfortable in it. The quiet rhythm of two minds turning the same problem over from different angles, neither one needing to perform for the other. It was, she realized, the first time since their wedding that she and Alistair had simply worked, without argument, without the weight of expectation pressing down on either of them. "Why traditional forge methods?" she asked eventually, half to herself. "Marchmont's works have been failing for years. Even if he had won Vance's contract, His equipment could never have met the delivery timeline. Why risk so much for a contract he could not have fulfilled regardless? Alistair considered this a moment. Pride, perhaps, or fear. A man watching his family's forge fall out of relevance does not always think clearly about what he can and cannot accomplish. He may simply have wanted to see us fail more than he wanted to see himself succeed. It was, Genevieve thought, a strangely sad sort of motive, and it did not entirely satisfy the coldness settling in her chest. Sabotage born of jealousy was one thing. Sabotage patient and calculated enough to tamper with machinery, to risk lives at a canal lock rather than simply losing a bid gracefully, spoke of something closer to desperation than pride. There is still the matter of proving intent to the board's satisfaction, she said, gathering the papers into order. Suspicion and a false account will not be enough on their own. We need Marchmont's own hand in this, something that cannot be explained away as coincidence. Then we present what we have to the Trade Council at Stonehaven, Alistair said. Not the estate board. The council has the authority to freeze a merchant's dealings pending formal investigation, and Marchmont's reputation among his own peers will not survive the accusation, proof or no proof, once it is laid before men of his own standing. Genevieve looked up at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice, by the ease with which he had shifted from doubting her methods a week ago to planning strategy alongside her now, as though it had always been natural between them. You believe the council will act on this? I believe, Alistair said, meeting her eyes across the scattered blueprints, that between the two of us we have built a case no reasonable counsel could ignore. I did not think that a week ago. I think it plainly now. Outside the office window, the afternoon light had begun to slant gold across the foundry yard, and for a moment neither of them moved to end the quiet settled between them. It was not yet trust, not entirely, not after 18 months of careful distance between husband and wife. But it was, Genevieve thought, watching him gather the last of the papers with the same careful precision she used herself, the beginning of something neither of them had known to look for when their fathers first arranged the match. The journey to Stonehaven took the better part of a day, and Genevieve spent much of it turning the coming presentation over in her mind, arranging the evidence into the order that would carry the most weight before men who did not know her, who owed her no particular benefit of the doubt. Alistair sat across from her in the carriage, unusually quiet, and it was not until the towers of the council hall rose into view against the grey afternoon sky that he finally spoke what had clearly been sitting on his mind since morning. You will want to change before we arrive, he said. It was not quite a command this time. It came out softer than that, almost a question. Genevieve glanced down at herself. She had worn her riding coat again, deliberately, the same tailored leather and wool she had worn to the exhibition 11 days ago, though this time layered beneath a formal grey travelling cloak suited to the cold. Is that truly what you wish to discuss, with the council waiting to hear evidence that could ruin a man's business? That is not what I meant. He shifted in his seat, choosing his words with visible care. The council at Stonehaven is a formal body, Genevieve. Older men, set in older customs. I have spent the whole journey trying to decide whether to ask you to wear something more conventional, if only to spare you their judgment. And what did you decide? Alistair was quiet a moment longer, watching the towers draw closer through the carriage window. I decided that the last time I asked you to dress differently, you proved me entirely wrong about what mattered in that room. I see no reason to make the same mistake twice. He met her eyes. Wear what you wore to the depot, Genevieve. Wear what you wore to the canal. Let them see exactly who solved this, in exactly the clothes she solved it in. It was, Genevieve realized, the closest thing to an apology he had offered her since the whole affair began, wrapped inside something that felt remarkably like respect. She said nothing, but she reached across the carriage and pressed his hand briefly before letting go, and neither of them spoke of it again as the carriage rolled through the gates of Stonehaven. The High Council Hall was every bit as imposing as its reputation suggested, a vast chamber of dark oak panelling and tall windows, where a dozen council members sat arranged along a raised bench beneath the county crest. Lord Marchmont himself had been summoned to answer the accusation, and Genevieve caught sight of him near the back of the chamber as she entered, a thin, greying man, with an expression caught somewhere between defiance and dread, his solicitor whispering urgently in his ear. She stood before the council in her riding clothes, exactly as Alistair had suggested, and laid out the evidence with the same clear, unhurried precision she had used on the exhibition floor 11 days before. The delivery ledgers, the tampered winch mechanism, the false account traced back through Marchmont's own solicitor's office, the payments timed precisely to the announcement of Vance's contract. "This is a serious accusation, Duchess," the chief councilman said, studying the documents with a frown. "Sabotage of a state infrastructure is no small matter, particularly when lives were placed at risk." "I am aware, my lord, which is why I would not bring it before this council without proof sufficient to withstand scrutiny." She gestured to Alistair, who stepped forward and laid the final document on the bench before them, a signed statement from one of Marchmont's own foundry workers, quietly obtained the previous evening, confirming the winch tampering had been ordered directly by their employer. A murmur ran through the chamber. Marchmont's face had gone the colour of ash. "I did not intend for anyone to be harmed," he said suddenly, his voice cracking the careful silence of the hall. "I intended only to delay the shipments, to buy myself time to secure another buyer for my forge before it fell entirely into ruin. The winch was never meant to fail so completely. I swear it before this council." "Intention does not undo consequence, my lord," the chief councilman said gravely. "You have placed men's lives at risk and attempted to ruin a rival estate through deception rather than fair trade. This council has no choice but to freeze all current dealings of your forge pending full investigation, and to bar you from any further contracts within this county until such investigation concludes." The words fell like a verdict, final and unappealable, and Marchmont sank into his seat, whatever fight remained in him extinguished entirely. Genevieve felt no particular satisfaction in watching it, only a quiet, tired relief that the danger to Ironridge's contract had finally been laid fully to rest. As the council moved on to formalities, Alistair leaned close, his voice low enough for her alone. "You did that." "We did that," she corrected softly. "No." He shook his head, and there was something entirely unguarded in his expression now, stripped of every last trace of the man who had once ordered her to change her clothes in a courtyard 11 days ago. "You found the delays. You caught them at the canal. You traced the account. I merely stood beside you and tried not to slow you down." "You believed me," Genevieve said. "Before the board, before the council, when it would have been easier not to. That is not nothing, Alistair." He studied her for a long moment, the noise of the council chamber fading into something distant and unimportant around them, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of the guarded authority he once wore like a second coat. "I do not think I ever properly saw you," he said quietly, "until you stopped waiting for my permission to be seen." 3 days after the council's ruling at Stonehaven, life at Ironridge had begun to settle into a rhythm neither Genevieve nor Alistair had known before. One of shared work rather than separate spheres, of evenings spent together over blueprints instead of apart in silence. The first shipment for Vance's Bristol works was due within the week, and the foundry had entered its final push of production, the great smelting furnace running at capacity for longer stretches than it ever had under the old methods. Genevieve had grown uneasy about it for days. The furnace was old, built in her father-in-law's time, and while it had served the estate faithfully for decades, it had never once been pushed to the sustained output the Vance contract now demanded of it. She had raised the concern with the foundry master twice already, requesting a full inspection of the pressure valves before the final production run began, and twice she had been assured the matter was in hand. She did not entirely believe it. She had learned over the past fortnight that assurances were rarely worth as much as her own 2 eyes. She was still awake past midnight, working through her father's old calculations by lamplight in the estate library, cross-checking the furnace's output figures against the safety tolerances he had recorded decades before, when the numbers refused to sit right no matter how many times she reworked them. The current production pace, sustained through the night as planned, would push the internal pressure well beyond anything the aging valve system had been built to withstand. She was reaching for her coat before she had fully finished the thought. The ride to the great smelting works took less than 15 minutes at full gallop, the night air sharp and cold against her face, Ferris's hooves striking hard and fast against the frozen ground. Even from a distance, before the works came fully into view, she could see something was wrong. The usual steady glow of the furnace fires had brightened to something far more violent, an orange too intense for a controlled burn, and a low, ominous groan carried across the yard that she recognized instantly from every hour she had ever spent studying pressure mechanisms. The furnace was building toward failure. She reached the works to find the night shift already in chaos, men shouting instructions that contradicted one another, the foundry master nowhere in sight, having apparently gone home hours before, under the mistaken assumption that the reduced overnight crew would manage without incident. The furnace itself groaned again, louder this time, the great iron casing visibly straining at its seams. "Clear the floor!" Genevieve shouted, swinging down from Ferris before he had fully stopped moving. "Everyone, out, now!" The workers, startled by the sudden authority in her voice, began to obey almost without thinking, streaming toward the yard doors as she pushed past them toward the furnace itself. She had studied this exact mechanism a dozen times over the past 2 weeks, had sketched its valve system from memory more than once while working alongside Alistair in the foundry office. And she knew with cold certainty that the primary release valve had jammed, exactly as her father's old notes had warned could happen under sustained overpressure. If it was not released manually, and soon, the entire casing would rupture. She was reaching for the emergency lever housing, already calculating how much time remained before the pressure grew beyond even manual control, when she heard hoofbeats thundering into the yard behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. Someone from the night crew must have run for the estate the moment the trouble began, and Alistair had wasted no time answering it. "Genevieve!" His voice cut across the yard, sharp with fear rather than authority for the first time she could remember. "Get back from there. The whole casing could go." "I know exactly what it could do," she called back, not slowing. "Which is why I am not leaving until it is fixed." He reached her within seconds, breathless, still in his nightclothes beneath a hastily thrown coat, and for one brief moment she thought he might simply drag her bodily away from the furnace, regardless of what she wanted. Instead, he looked at the jammed valve housing she was already working at, looked at the strain visible in the iron seams above them, and made a decision she would not fully understand the weight of until much later. "Tell me what to do," he said. "The lever there, beside you, it controls the secondary release. When I say, pull it with everything you have and hold it, it will not move easily." "And if it does not move at all?" Genevieve did not answer that. There was no comforting answer to give, and she suspected he already knew it. Instead, she turned her full attention to the primary valve, fingers working quickly at the jammed mechanism, the heat radiating off the furnace casing now fierce enough to sting against her exposed skin, the groan of straining metal growing louder with every passing second. "Now," she said finally, bracing herself against the housing. "Pull now, Alistair, and do not let go until I tell you." He threw his weight against the lever with everything he had, and somewhere beneath the furnace's furious roar, Genevieve heard the first faint hiss of pressure beginning, at last, to escape through the release valve rather than tearing through the casing entirely. It was not enough yet, not nearly enough, but it was, for the first time since she had ridden into the yard, the sound of a disaster that might still be stopped in time. The hiss of escaping steam grew louder, but not fast enough. Genevieve could feel it in the vibration beneath her boots, the furnace casing still groaning under pressure the secondary valve alone could not fully relieve. She had known this might happen. The old system had never been designed to release pressure through a single point once it built this high. It needed a second path, one that did not exist yet in the original mechanism, one that existed only in the modified valve design she had sketched in her father's notebook 2 nights ago and never finished building. "It is not enough," she said, half to herself, already moving toward the tool rack bolted to the far wall. "The secondary release alone will not hold the casing steady long enough to bring the pressure down safely. We need the auxiliary line open as well." "There is no auxiliary line," Alistair called back, still braced hard against the lever, sweat streaking through the soot already gathering on his face. "Not on this furnace." "There will be." Genevieve seized a length of copper piping and a wrench from the rack, running back toward the furnace's rear casing, where a sealed access plate sat bolted shut, exactly where her calculations told her a secondary outlet could be forced if the geometry of the original design was to be trusted. "My father drew this modification for the Ironridge furnace 15 years ago. He never built it. No one ever needed it badly enough to try. And you think tonight is the night to test an unbuilt design? I think tonight is the night we have no other choice." She worked quickly, hands steady despite the furnace's furious heat pressing against her skin, loosening the access plate's bolts one by one while Alistair held the lever with everything his strength could give. The metal was hot enough to scorch through her gloves in places, and twice the wrench slipped against sweat-slicked iron, but she did not stop, did not allow herself the luxury of doubt while the casing groaned louder above her. "Genevieve, if that plate gives way wrong, the pressure could—" "I know what it could do." She did not look up from her work. "I also know what happens if we do nothing. Hold the lever, Alistair. Do not let go, whatever happens next." The final bolt gave way with a sharp crack, and for one terrible heartbeat, nothing happened at all. The furnace's roar suspended in a silence more frightening than the noise had been. Then, with a violent rush, steam began pouring through the newly opened access point, venting hard and fast into the night air above the works, and the groaning strain in the casing began, at last, to ease. Genevieve fitted the copper piping into place with hands that shook now that the worst danger had passed, securing it just enough to direct the escaping steam safely away from the working floor, and stepped back to watch the furnace settle, its violent orange glow gradually softening back towards something steady and controlled. Beside her, Alistair finally released the lever, his arms trembling from the sustained effort, and sank against the housing behind him, breathing hard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The night crew had begun creeping back toward the doors, drawn by the sudden quiet, faces pale with the understanding of how close the works had come to disaster. "You built that from a 15-year-old sketch," Alistair said finally, staring at the modified valve as though seeing it for the first time. "In the dark. In minutes." "I have had a great deal of practice reading my father's notebooks." Genevieve pulled off her scorched gloves, examining the raw skin beneath with more curiosity than concern. "It was not perfect. A proper installation would take a full day's work, not a rushed one at midnight. But it held." "It held because you understood something about this furnace that no one else in this county has ever bothered to learn." Alistair pushed himself upright, crossing the short distance between them, and there was something in his expression now that had nothing to do with furnaces or contracts at all. "You could have stayed at the estate tonight. You could have sent word and waited for morning. By morning there would have been nothing left to save." "I know." His voice had gone quiet, stripped of every careful formality he had once worn like armor around her. "I simply find myself unable to stop thinking of how close I came to losing you in the process of saving it." Genevieve looked up at him, coal dust and steam scald marking them both, the furnace behind them finally settling into its ordinary, steady hum, and found she did not know quite what to say to that. 18 months of careful distance did not unravel easily, even after everything they had weathered together these past 2 weeks. But something in his voice reached past the exhaustion and the lingering fear still coursing through her, settling somewhere she had not expected to feel it. "You did not lose me," she said finally. "You held the lever exactly when I needed you to. That is not nothing, Alistair." He reached out, brushing a streak of soot from her cheek with a gentleness that startled her more than the danger they had just survived. "No," he agreed quietly. "It is not nothing at all." Behind them, the foundry crew had begun the slow work of securing the furnace for the remainder of the night, murmuring among themselves about the Duchess, who had ridden in alone to save the works, about the Duke, who had stood beside her without hesitation when the moment demanded it. By dawn, Genevieve knew, the story would have travelled the length of the county twice over. The production run, delayed but not destroyed, would resume within the day. The final shipment for Vance's Bristol works would leave port exactly on schedule. And whatever fragile, unexpected thing had begun growing between herself and Alistair since the morning she rode out in riding clothes instead of silk, it had, she suspected, just been forged as surely and as permanently as the iron cooling now in the furnace behind them. 2 days after the furnace had nearly failed, the final shipment for Lord Vance's Bristol works rolled out of the foundry gates precisely on schedule, 60 wagons loaded with regulated forge equipment that would, within the month, begin transforming the largest ironworks in the west of England. Genevieve watched the wagons depart from the foundry yard alongside Alistair, both of them still faintly marked by the events of that night, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not expected to feel this fully. Not triumph exactly, but something steadier, something closer to belonging. Lord Vance himself arrived at Ironridge the following afternoon, having ridden ahead of his own shipment to inspect the finished goods before they left the county entirely. He found Genevieve and Alistair waiting for him at the ridge overlook above the works, the spot where the whole of the estate's operations spread out below them in the pale autumn light. The smelting furnace steady and quiet now, the depot yards full once more with proper coal stores, the canal barges moving without incident along the water. "A remarkable sight, Your Grace," Vance said, dismounting and surveying the works below with open satisfaction. "I have seen a great many foundries in my time. Few have impressed me as thoroughly as this one." "The credit belongs almost entirely to my wife, my lord," Alistair said, and there was no hesitation in the words this time, no careful diplomacy weighing them down. Every solution this estate found over the past fortnight, from the forge model itself to the furnace repair 3 nights ago, came from her hand and her father's notebooks before that. Vance turned to Genevieve with the particular sharp attention she remembered from the exhibition floor, though softened now with something closer to genuine respect. "I understand there was some trouble with the great furnace. The wagon drivers spoke of little else the whole journey here." "A jammed valve, my lord, and rather too much pressure for the old system to bear alone." Genevieve kept her tone even, though the memory of that night still sat close beneath her composure. "We managed it in time." "You managed it," Vance corrected. "By all accounts I have heard, largely alone, at midnight, with a design you built from your father's 15-year-old sketches." He studied her a moment longer, then reached into his coat and produced a folded document sealed with the crimson wax of his own house. "The permanent partnership deed, Duchess. I had my solicitors draw it up the moment word reached me that the Stonehaven Council had ruled against Marchmont. I do not intend to risk losing this contract to a rival's second attempt at sabotage. Nor do I intend to let a working relationship this valuable remain merely temporary." Genevieve took the document with steady hands, though her heart had quickened considerably. It named Ironridge as Vance's exclusive manufacturing partner for the next decade, terms far beyond anything the original contract had promised, terms that would secure the estate's prosperity for a generation to come. She glanced at Alistair before signing, an old habit of deference she had not quite shaken, though she suspected now it came less from uncertainty and more from genuine wish to share the moment with him. "Sign it," he said quietly. "It is yours to sign as much as mine." She signed her name beneath his on the deed, and Vance, watching the exchange with evident approval, offered his hand to them both before mounting his horse once more. "I will send word when the Bristol works are fully operational," he said. "I suspect, given what I have witnessed here these past 16 days, that Ironridge will have no shortage of further business from my house in the years to come." With that, he rode off down the Ridge Road, his escort falling in behind him, leaving Genevieve and Alistair alone at the overlook with the deed still fresh in her hands. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the wind stirring gently across the hilltop, the whole of the estate's works spread out below them like a map of everything they had survived together. 16 days ago, Alistair said finally, I stood in the courtyard and told you to dress like a duchess or stay home. I remember. I have thought a great deal these past few days about how wrong I was. He turned to face her fully, and whatever careful distance had once defined the space between them was entirely absent now. You have never once needed a silk gown to prove yourself worthy of this estate, Genevieve, You proved it in riding leathers, at an exhibition, at a coal depot, at a canal lock in the middle of the night, and finally, in front of a furnace that very nearly cost you your life. I do not think there has been a single moment since that morning where you were anything less than exactly what this house needed. He reached into the satchel slung across his own shoulder, one Genevieve had not noticed him carrying until now, and produced a folded leather coat, finely tailored, the deep brown leather stamped near the collar with the ironworks seal, her own initials worked in small, careful stitching beneath it. "I had it commissioned 3 days ago," he said, offering it to her, not as a gift from a duke to his Duchess, as a gift from a partner who has finally learned to see what stood beside him all along. Genevieve took the coat, running her fingers over the stitched seal, and felt something loosen in her chest that had sat tight and guarded there since the morning of their wedding 18 months ago. "I did not marry for love, Alistair," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "But I think, standing here now, I have found something rather close to it regardless." Below them, the foundry's smoke rose steady and grey against the autumn sky, the sound of the works carrying faintly up the hillside, and for the first time since she had ridden out in riding clothes instead of silk, Genevieve felt entirely, unmistakably, at home.